Hello everyone, and welcome to our fifth video in our series about economic growth and sustainable development. Today we are here to talk about policies that are used by the government and the RBA through both budgetary and monetary policy that are used to regulate the amount of aggregate demand and economic activity to try and make sure we have the best level of economic growth that is going to help us increase the size of the economy over consecutive periods. Hopefully you've been keeping up with this, that you've followed the last time we talked about costs and benefits or strengths and weaknesses of economic growth. Before that, we went into aggregate demand, aggregate supply side factors, and previous to that, how we measure and some limitations of the measurements of economic growth. So let's get straight into it. First, we're going to talk about monetary policy. Monetary policy is all about the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is also known as the RBA, using changes in interest rates to control spending and regulate the level of economic activity and GDP. Basically, this is just like the cost of borrowing money. Like whenever you get a loan, use a credit card, whatever, you pay interest on whatever money you've borrowed. Or if you save money with a bank or you invest money in a savings account, you receive interest as a reward for saving. So interest rates represent the cost to firms and households for borrowing credit. So for example, at the moment on my home loan, I think we pay about 3.6% interest on our home loan. And so that means that for every period we pay the amount we owe, we pay 3.6% of that extra in interest. Some people who have credit cards have interest rates of up to 20%. So you could pay back an extra 20% of what you owe in interest each month. Alternatively, it presents a reward to those who choose to save. So if interest rates are high, it usually means people tend to save their money because they're going to get rewarded for saving. They're going to be given extra money for saving that money, which is always nice. It's not the case at the moment because interest rates are at the lowest they've ever been. The cash rate, which is what the RBA sets, banks then use to help set their interest rates, is 0.25, which is the lowest it's ever been in history in Australia. And essentially that's because they're trying to get people to borrow more money to spend and stimulate the economy during this giant global slowdown because of the pandemic. So the last little question we've got here is, would the RBA increase or decrease interest rates during a boom? Well, during a boom, hopefully you remember from the business cycle, economic growth is high, inflation is high, and unemployment is low. And that means that if unemployment's really low, there's going to be a lot of spending. If economic growth is really high, we might be pushing towards our productive capacity. And if inflation is high, they want to slow things down. So if they want to slow things down, what are they going to do with interest rates? They're going to increase them, because if they increase interest rates, it means people are going to slow down their spending and save more because there's a reward for saving. And then that way there'll be more saving and less private consumption spending, which means aggregate demand would fall. This would then send a signal to producers to produce less because there's less demand overall, and this would decrease the overall level of economic growth. And that's how monetary policy works. Alternatively, if we're in a trough or we're slowing down into a recession, which we currently are, they decrease interest rates because then people are more incentivized to borrow money because it's going to cost them less to pay it back, and then they can invest it or spend it on the things that they want or need. Next up, we've got budgetary policy, which is all about the government spending or how they change the composition of receipts and outlays they get along the year. So each May, except for this year, because this year is a very special, bizarre year in the economy, the government announces their budget on budget night and basically outlines all the changes to the economy over the coming year. So all the spending, all the government projects they're going to go through with, as well as all the changes to like tax rates and all those kind of things. And so it involves changing tax rates along with government outlays. And since taxes are a leakage and government outlays are an injection, the budget can alter the overall level of aggregate demand. And they say budgetary policies are applied in a counter-cyclical way. And what that means is how we looked at the business cycle. I'm going to draw it on the slide just for the benefit of us all. So how we had the business cycle going up and down like that. It's done in a counter-cyclical way. So it means that when we're in these peaks, it tries to slow things down. And when we're in these troughs, it tries to speed things back up. So we can kind of try and be on that long-term trend line where we try and flatten it out and keep economic growth around that sustainable level. So there are some examples of how they do this. So with the government spending more than they're receiving, we call that a expansionary budget, which means they're trying to stimulate the economy and increase the overall level of aggregate demand because an increase in government spending is an increase in injections, which means there's more aggregate demand overall. And they do this through things like infrastructure projects, like spending on roads and many of those kind of things, like new rail networks, those kind of things. Or they can do things like decreasing tax rates. So an example here in 2020, the government cut small business tax to 26%, which increases private investment spending because small businesses suddenly are more willing to invest and expand because suddenly they've got a lower cost of production. There's also that they doubled welfare payments currently during the pandemic through the job seeker allowance, meaning that rather than getting, I think it was around $550 per week, people were getting up to $1,000 per week in welfare, which is fairly significant. That's going to increase their consumption spending and stimulate the economy a lot more, and therefore try and lead to higher rates of economic growth. We've also got what's called aggregate supply side policies, which can also sometimes be called microeconomic reforms. And these are widely used to try and improve our efficiency and increase aggregate supply through that way. So this is anything that the government puts in place that directly impacts aggregate supply and doesn't really impact aggregate demand. So cutting tax rates for businesses often can do this because it means businesses have a lower cost of production and will produce more. Privatization and moves to lift government efficiency. The government sold off a lot of their government-owned businesses because when they're privatized, they are essentially profit-seeking businesses and will try and cut costs to maximize profits, and therefore they'll be more efficient in the long term. Market deregulation, which means taking away unnecessary rules and laws in certain areas. So things like they removed some penalty rates for weekends and public holidays to try and make businesses more competitive and efficient, and therefore make them more willing to supply and more able to supply. Promoting greater competition. So we've got the ACCC, who prevents monopolies from occurring or prevents any anti-competitive behavior, and this keeps businesses having to be more efficient and therefore being able to produce more. And tariff cuts, which is when businesses when countries don't have unnecessary taxes on trade of goods and services, so then try and maximize our exports and get cheaper imports, which are used in production, which can also lower cost of production for businesses and help us supply more overall. Lastly, talk a little bit more about that international side of things. So policies involving international cooperation can affect economic growth. So internationally, some governments work together to influence the rate of economic growth. So for example, in the GFC, there was substantial international cooperation to tackle that problem. So many countries discuss the problem and use expansionary budgetary and monetary policies to combat that problem. Similar is happening between some countries now. We've got a little bit of the opposite happening between Australia and China at the moment, where China is not cooperating with Australia very much, and it's going to hurt our trade a lot because China is our biggest trading partner. So that'll be very interesting to see how that unfolds over the coming months. But usually in massive global events, many countries, especially some of the countries that are allied, tend to try and work together to do the best they can for their economies. So in summary, monetary policy is used to change the level of interest rates, which usually affect the amount of spending and investment in the economy. It basically affects the cost of borrowing, and that can then impact, either stimulate or slow down aggregate demand. So stimulate aggregate demand if interest rates are decreased, or slow down aggregate demand if interest rates are increased. Budgetary policy is changing either the tax receipts that the government receives or the outlays they spend on infrastructure projects, wages, and all those kind of welfare, etc. If the government's spending more money, that is going to be stimulating aggregate demand, or if the government is receiving more tax, it's going to slow down aggregate demand because people are going to have less income. I hope this was all helpful to you. If you have any questions at all, feel free to send me an email, leave a comment below, or send me a message of any kind. Next up, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the environmental side of economic growth, which we don't get to touch on too often otherwise, which is always good, and talk about overall the impact and long-term impact that economic growth can have on the environment, and some of the things the government puts in place to try and prevent it from not being sustainable in the long term. So on that, I hope you have a wonderful day and that you are also not doing work on a Saturday like I currently am. And hopefully the baby that I'm trying to put down for a nap will nap soon. Other than that, have a wonderful weekend and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.